digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're bringing to you the VR Writers' Room live from Google Campus. We were joined by Dave Cook, the founder of Card Shark Comics, along with Andy Ewington, owner of 45 Limited and comic writer. We also have with us Phil Harris, the former senior content designer for One Thumb Mobile. And we have with us Jeff Gomez, CEO of Starlight Runner, Kevin Williams, the founder and owner of KWP Consultancy and former Disney Imagineer, Dave Ranyard, former studio director at London Studios for Sony Computer Entertainment, and Rob Morgan, writer on the Assembly VR and formerly from Sony Computer Entertainment. We're going to start by looking at the outcomes of the VR Writers' Room, looking first at the audience category, where we talked about the need to give mental breaks and a transitionary space to people who are experiencing VR for the first time. And I want to talk a little bit about cognitive memory and the function that they have when they're experiencing that experience in VR. It means that they will remember that as if that was a memory that happened to them. So give it 5 years' time, you're actually going to see this as a subset of medical health, people who are suffering from PTSD because they had an experience in VR that they cannot get over. It will happen. Trust me, I said it. Come back to me in 5 years' time. If I'm not right, I will apologise, but I genuinely believe that will be a subset of mental health. But I'm curious, Rob, to hear from you on this, in terms of this idea of requiring that space, that mental space and that pacing, if you like, to be able to ground the audience when they are experiencing something quite intense in VR.
Yeah, so, sorry, is my mic on? Yes. So we, when I was still working at PlayStation, one of the things that we had to kind of consider was the unknowns of how long users could be in the headset for, and we wondered if we'd have to ping up a message that warned people after a certain amount of time, in the same way that some games give you like a warning that says, why don't you go and make a sandwich now? And that's stuff that VR technology will still have to deal with. It may even be required by law to do that kind of stuff. But there's a lot we can do certainly in storytelling and in writing terms, to make that kind of thing an easier pill to swallow. So like, if you think about, from a game perspective, really good game design involves structures of breathing in and out. Like you were saying, you need an action moment, and then you need to be brought back down into a moment where you can pace yourself. But this is going to work slightly differently in VR for a start, because action, deathmatch, lots and lots of the stereotypically hardcore gaming experiences that we might have originally imagined in VR actually work very differently, or don't work at all in VR and actually have to be remodeled.
Which brings me to another really interesting point that we had, and that was about setting this benchmark of expectation for the audience. So one of the things that we're still going to have to need to do, at least for the first few years as VR emerges as a new medium, is really be part educationary in that process with the audience, and really set the expectation and guide them through what they can expect from VR. Because for many people, it's going to be the first time that they're going to experience this. And so whatever your experience is the first time that they're ever going to have an experience with VR. And what we do know is that it doesn't really matter what kind of VR somebody is experiencing, whether that is live 360 film, whether that is mobile VR, whether that is true console VR. If they have a bad experience, they are going to paint the entirety of the medium of VR with the same brush. And if they think they've had a bad experience, they're just going to say, you know what, I'm not doing it again, it was bad. And it doesn't make a difference to them that it was actually something completely different. If it was, mobile VR versus, live 360 film, it makes no difference to them. They still see it as the same thing. So it's our responsibility as an industry and as a medium to make sure that actually we help to guide this audience through this process and give them an understanding of the benchmarks of what they can expect on different platforms and different devices. But I'm curious, Dave, just to understand from your perspective, what your viewpoint is on that, in terms of do you feel that there are enough developers and enough creators out there who feel that we do have that burden of responsibility?
So the platform holders are definitely aware that one of the biggest risks for VR is like bad VR being the first experience for people. I think there'll still be some stuff that gets through that, and you sort of hear a few reports of, I played that, but it made me sick. And I think there's some issues around that. Hopefully that will disappear. One of the things I've seen, particularly since E3, which is a couple of weeks ago, is that big traditional IPs moving to VR is a great news story for a platform holder, but it might be a bit of a mismatch for the audience. So AAA game, I won't name any, but AAA game moves to VR. Let's say it's all about hand-to-hand combat, and then you do the VR experience, and it's all about investigation. It's like it's sort of it's not the same game to the punters, and so I think that there's a little bit of an anticlimax there for people. So for a platform holder, it's great to say we've signed massive game, but it's not actually that game. It's like a spin-off. It's kind of like a spin-off of a TV series that doesn't get traction because it's not. When Joey did Joey, it wasn't Friends, right? And so people tuned in. It's not Friends, and it's not what they're expecting. And so I think there's potentially a bit of a stutter there. However, I also think that's an opportunity because it means that people creating new IP, there will be more room for that. So it's a bit harder for the traditional IPs. And that's where I think it's interesting. And there are lots of developers. And one of the things that VR's been really good for is indie developers because you don't necessarily need a massive art budget to make a really cool experience. Yeah. And so it's more about like the imagination and the design smarts of indie developers.
Okay. I can practically feel Jeff like radiating at me. So, Jeff, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on this, because this idea that existing franchises and IPs are stepping into a territory that is perhaps not suited to them. I think that there's a lot here in terms of the transmedia world building approach or lack thereof when it comes to these big franchises who are trying to dabble in VR.
You're absolutely right. Here's some exciting kind of insider information. I have to be a little vague, but the one thing that is interesting to me is that Starlight Runner, my company, is being approached to help flesh out these story worlds, to make them essentially extend beyond the television or movie screen by adding detail, backstory, expanding upon the physical environments with imagination and with an idea toward engagement.
So when we were talking about audience, there were a couple of key findings that came up.
And there's a lot of potential in games to create asynchronous gameplay where one person who's a participant has the headset experience, but another participant has a completely different experience on the screen. And you have completely different sets of knowledge. You can't do the classic thing where you walk around in a shooter and look at each other's screen, look at each other's thing on the split screen like my brother always used to do to me when we played GoldenEye when we were kids. But imagine not just being able to say, okay, the show is now ready to put you in the helmet, you can have 2 minutes of helmet time. But imagine if one person who's watching the show gets to be in the helmet and learn something different about the show, and actually there's a level of asynchronous knowledge within the living room between the two people who are watching the show. Somebody finds something out, somebody sees a different perspective on the same scene. And that could be really interesting as well, because you can construct a mystery where different people can watch different aspects of the same show and learn different things.
There's something we need to be aware of here. You're talking about the consumer application.
Sure.
So we in the out-of-home entertainment application have to consider that most people go to theme parks for a social experience with other individuals. And to use this type of technology in that sector, we have to make allowances. And that's why you look at something like, well, we can't talk about the new Darren Brown VR Dark Rider, but we can talk about Galactica, the roller coaster. Everybody in that roller coaster is going to have the same experience, but they have to communicate with each other. And we're lucky that we can use a higher level of hardware equipment to try and bring an audience into a VR experience, rather than sadly what we have at the moment with the consumer VR, which is a very singular experience. Though, again, I don't know how the Star Trek Bridge Commander system is going to work with that. No, please.
I've only seen it a little bit about the Star Trek, but that looked absolutely phenomenal in terms of what you can do, where you've got different people at different consoles having to work together, but obviously the experience themselves, if you're just sitting as a passerby watching these four people just sitting there all going, doing all of this. But it looks amazing.
That Star Trek thing, that's the beginning of
absolutely. I mean, that
phase of
as soon as I saw
gaming,
that, I was like, I'm in. That's what I want to do.
I think it's a great example of a big IP successfully doing something in VR.
But it works because they have that. They have to work together in order to get the
but
how real is it, though, really? Is it a demo? Where are we regarding it? It's got all our juices flowing, but is it reality?
Does anybody have any questions that they want to talk about in terms of the audience section?
Accessibility. Like guiding people with sound is good for people who can hear. So do you always have to have several things at once, or will there be a switch, or you can choose later on?
It has to be fluid across multiple levels. Especially in our sector, we have to consider accessibility for the widest possible common denominator. So that's people that are impaired, the colourblind. It's interesting, we do 3D movies when a large number of the audience can't actually see good 3D. So we have to be able to offer the widest stimuli, as it were, to achieve the best bang for buck.
How do you get that text into VR?
Reading is a challenge on VR. I've worked on games and prototypes that have had a text panel in front of you experience. It's one of the reasons that we need to find new tools for world building, because exposition is not if you have to do a lot of exposition, then possibly VR is not necessarily the format for you. But on the other hand, a format that I am dying to see for VR is a Kindle-esque format where you have a screen that's full of text where it's not trying to render it very close. You can customize entirely where it displays. You can even use the eye tracking in the headset.
I just want to kind of move on to the world building aspect. And what I wanted to do is actually follow on from what Phil was saying, because I remember this conversation about the newspaper. And then we moved on to a conversation about Schrödinger's mouse.
Yes,
so,
Schrödinger's mouse.
Phil, would you care to explain that one?
Meow.
So when you're creating a world, you have to think about how much world you're creating. I'm a narrative designer. I create worlds. I've created large background histories, and I think canon's really, really important for people to use, so that the user has the experience that there is a history to the world and the experience that they're engaging in. But you can possibly go too far. So if you take a real live 3D room, an actual room that's going on, and there's a mouse that has died under the sofa, and then you put it into a virtual reality environment, do you put the mouse under the sofa? Is it Schrödinger's mouse? Is it alive or dead, or whatever state it's in? Are you just going into too much detail, or will somebody say, "Oh, the mouse was never under the sofa"? There's a problem with adapting very, very strong canon, which people have experienced in a different way, something like Star Trek, and then people experiencing it and going, "You haven't done this right. This isn't the Star Trek I remember. It's not in the style. It's not in the form that I expect." And I think people who have to write in those canons, I know a few people who've written in the Warhammer world, the fantasy role-playing world, and they've found there's such a weight of canon there, and the fans are so strong about the canon that it actually starts to become impossible to write into that canon, and maybe it's easier to create something else.
It's like trying to write Star Wars.
Yeah, and also just to make sure, going back to that simplicity thing, that you start off simple, because people are going to be experiencing all these new things with virtual reality, and then you slowly add the complexity, you slowly add the dimension, because it adds so much to the experience. That you're playing about with more things this time, and all these things. So going back to E3, there was quite a lot of VR stuff going on, but the thing that really got me was when EA said they were doing Star Wars Battlefield's X-Wing, and I was just like, I can fly an X-Wing. Yeah, I'm sold.
Managing perceptions, though. If it isn't that fighter, if it isn't that quality of graphics, if it isn't that level of experience, then you're going to be disappointed.
No, and I will be very vocal about that as well.
But this is the challenge about doing narrative in VR, because VR sets up really high expectations. That's what it does. And so suddenly storytelling issues are not just issues that might lose you half a star in your review of your game. Suddenly storytelling issues are just as much immersion issues as a visual glitch. If you get a texture pop, or if you get a gravity glitch, or something that you see in games all the time that pops you out of immersion in VR, if you can walk through the wall, that pops you out of immersion in VR. But equally, if you have a story issue, if a fan is very familiar with what the inside of an X-Wing looks like. Because I could probably sit there and go, that button's in the wrong place. And suddenly I remember, I'm wearing a plastic helmet. It's not, the immersion is lost. And equally, this is as much of a problem when you're building protagonists, because if you don't understand your protagonist, or if you don't sympathize with your protagonist, suddenly it's an immersion problem. It's not just a quality of narrative problem. And it makes you not engage, you get bored, you get fatigued faster.
Yeah, often I talk about cardboard cutout villains in settings. If you don't give your villains any background, if you don't give them any type of gravitas, if you don't give them anything to link to, if all those characters, and then you have to look at all the characters. Now, Joseph Campbell talks about the monomyth and the hero's journey, but once you move into this type of experience, then you're starting to look at the monomyths of more than one character, going through this experience, because people may start engaging with the wrong person for the writers, because they've written a lot about this person. So you've got to have this incredibly canny writing team who are creating this experience, thinking about all the characters and how the audience is going to interact with them within that world.
And one of the grounding forces for this myriad of characters is the story Bible, or the canon, as we might call it. Yes. And Jeff, I want to kind of throw this one open to you, because obviously when it comes to story Bibles, there's a lot of misconceptions about what that might actually mean in the context of narrative for VR. So from your perspective, when we're talking about creating a story Bible for a VR universe, what does that actually mean for you?
I have a little experience with creating franchise mythologies and Bibles that provide guidance to writers across all kinds of different media to extend the story world and have it work effectively on different media platforms. So what's critical when you're thinking about a story Bible for a VR experience is for you to understand the fundamental messaging that's being conveyed by this experience. Chances are what you're working on is going to be short in format, at least to start with. So everything that's in this world that your audience member is going to be immersed in has to have meaning, has to speak to the narrative and speak to the themes and messages that the storyteller is attempting to convey. These are things that you need to think about and put into this Bible so that it can spark the imagination of the people who are working on everything from script to set design to prequels, sequels, and components that can show up on social media to enhance the VR experience.
Can I just add to that? And I think this, when you're talking about canon, it's the iceberg thing. The 20% that you see above the water is what the players experience, or what the people who are experiencing the narrative, the virtual reality setting, is the 80% underneath. And one of the people I always talk about is Tolkien. Tolkien, having written a lot of the background history, he can mention things in Lord of the Rings with such gravitas because he knows he's written about them, but he doesn't have to go into them in detail. Unfortunately, at other points, Tolkien does go into detail, and I think he's a little dry then. But
what that does do is it lends confidence in everything that he says and everything he talks about, because he knows that the depth is there.
Just the 20%, 80% thing is such a good rule of thumb, but also as VR develops, one of the ways that we engage with reality and also kind of verify reality moment to moment is that if we want to look closer at something, we can, which means that as VR develops and our standard for how realistic it is also develops, we need to be able to know that we can not just look at the surface of a room, we can look under the bed and find that the dead mouse is there if we want to. And so actually, we've worked in the Harry Potter franchise, and that, for all the right reasons, has a very strict kind of regime of making sure that you get it right. Doing that kind of world Bible for VR, for a franchise of that size, it requires new things, not just because you might need, for a standard game, 2D game, you might need to know what things look like. But in a VR game, you might suddenly need to know how much they weigh or what they do when you come close to them or something like that.
The physics of the object.
Right, exactly. And so you might need to take into account the fact that the player might do things that you don't expect with it. Further down the line, as we get more realistic NPCs, non-player characters, other characters appearing in virtual reality, then remember, if you can go up, if you can be in the same room as a character in virtual reality, then in order to maintain realism, you have to know how that character will react if the player does something unexpected. So suddenly the World Bible has to be able to encompass what would a character like Captain Kirk do if he's talking to you and you walk around behind him and you ignore him or you go and look over there, which people do in standard games all the time, and the character just maintains their monologue. And
well, this is one of the reasons why the cinema industry is so scared of what virtual reality has to offer. There's a phrase in the Hollywood trope that agency forces us down a path where we look behind the cowboy city. The cowboy town argument is that if you look behind the frontage of a cowboy town, there's nothing there. It's just, it's fake. It's pure fakery. An agency, be it interactive cinema or virtual reality, means that you can now look behind the frontage of these buildings. And I think from the consumer game point of view, sorry to harp on about the differences between commercial and consumer gaming, but I think that a lot of consumer games do force people down a very linear path.
Oh, yeah.
No matter how much they say they're giving you a sandbox, they really are giving you a sandbox, but you're attached to a leash.
It's very much the illusion of agency.
I wouldn't mind just coming back on that, because we are now getting companies like Improbable Worlds who are giving us tools to make persistent worlds. And so I think in those spaces, you can drop a cup on a planet and go away and come back 3 years later and it will still be there, unless somebody else has landed there and picked it up and moved it. And that kind of persistence, I think, will actually help with some of these issues, because in theory, they won't be building towns, the cowboy frontage, without anything behind it, and there will be some sense of persistent time.
And we'll also learn how bad litterbugs everybody is.
Everybody's
Litterbugs.
Okay, I'm aware we've got a question in the middle of the room.
I'm just carrying on that theme though. I worked on a game called Skate for EA. It was a big open world skateboarding game, and we ran some metrics on it. It was a really big world. I mean, it's like you could skate anywhere, blah 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 blah. And we ran some metrics on it, and 2080 thing popped up that most people, in fact, almost all of the people were spending 20% of their time, all the time, in 20% of the world. We need to build 80% of the world, in effect. And we could have roughed it out, I suppose, and then got somebody to go around it and said like which would have cracked it.
Yeah.
Saved ourselves a lot of artists a lot of time. And I'm just wondering if a huge world in itself. I mean, from that game especially. I mean, a huge world of its own isn't necessarily a hugely interesting thing. It's got to be populated with interesting.
It doesn't need to be a big world, it just needs to be interesting.
We're going to find out the answer to that when No Man's Sky comes out.
Yeah.
But actually, on that point about skate, I mean, I think now people do, in their betas and so on, do hotspots and find out more. So there's an element of trimming that you can build into your world building now.
Okay, just while we're taking questions, Mookie, are you in the room? Wave so I can see. There you are. Hello, Mookie. Thank you for your question. So, everybody, Mookie would like to know of at least one VR experience that is not a game experience that you think is a good VR experience.
What do you mean by game? Sorry, not
Mookie.
What are your defines?
All right. Anything not a video game.
My one at the moment is Star Charts VR, which I'm absolutely loving, and purely because it's something that is educational. I'm interested in space anyway, and it's something I can share with my son. I actually bought him a Google Cardboard that I introduced him to One VR. He absolutely loves it. Obviously, I monitor how long he's on it, but he just loves going around looking at different planets. And
are you getting that? Can you get out of VR now, please?
Yeah.
I'm getting that a lot now. It's like,
Just wait for Minecraft.
Just wait for Minecraft. Can I have my phone back, please? I need my phone back. I haven't checked my Facebook.
I have to get a second phone for VR because honestly, it's just not fun when I can't do the things I need to do on my mobile phone.
Go down to Alton Towers, try out Galactica. That's the new roller coaster with a VR component. It's a favourite.
I would say Tilt Brush.
Yes.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay.
I'm with the planets.
You're with the
be honest.
planets.
I really, really enjoyed the experience, and it was really, really fascinating. It might not have been quite the same experience, but I think there's more than one of them. But this idea of like mixing education with exploration is fantastic. It's absolutely brilliant. It's the future of education to me.
For me, there's a live action 3D, really a very short experience called Imago. I was involved in it at the very surface level, but credit for it absolutely goes to the group of students. They are at Carnegie Mellon's Media Center, something like that. And it's a live action 360 experience. It takes advantage of the current limitations of the medium. You are in the head, you're seeing through the eyes of a person who's been paralyzed, and they have a slightly kind of magical realist experience, but also it's about disempowerment. And so you don't move around, but it's about someone who is experiencing an inability to move around. And it's really interesting and very moving. And I think that's a great use of kind of the fact that we don't have perfect control in VR 360 live action right now, but that's the kind of thing it can be used for that's really interesting.
So Sean was wanting to know whether or not there... I want to actually read your question because it was quite a long question, but it was basically about whether or not there aren't more AAAs getting involved because actually they don't want to put the money in. They don't want to take the risk. Was that pretty much it?
So is the financial risk, is that something that they're not taking yet? They're taking very much into account, which is why VR games are typically associated with, as you said before, indies, and that there's no one who's yet hedging their bets.
I think there were a few at E3, to be honest. I think some of that comes down to how successful they've been at world building. So, for example, Star Trek has been done in loads of different genres, right? And, to a greater or lesser extent, but it's stood the test of time and stood the test of those different genres, whereas some of the gaming AAAs are, not all of them, but some of them are struggling a bit.
And Star Wars has components.
Let's be blunt here. The situation is that the AAA studios would not want to touch VR because they got burnt the last time that VR tried to make a penetration into the mainstream, and it was only the indies that had the balls, pardon my French, for actually taking on and developing content for it. And, as all AAAs do, as soon as they can smell enough blood in the water, that's when the sharks usually jump in. And we're getting to a stage now where there will be enough units either through the Vive's number or through Sony or Oculus, that it will be worthwhile these guys to put the 100-man development team behind this type of project.
I think we'll know a lot more after this coming Christmas.
Definitely.
Yeah, and given the fact that there are free products out there, it's about one of them hitting it right. Yeah. And but if they hit it wrong, Sony has a bit of a habit of dropping extra technology, sort of the PS Vita. I don't know how many times I saw the PSP relaunched, in different styles. But I've really feel that Sony are very confident about it this time. It's something about the way that they went into the press conference that they've done the play testing. They're confident that the play testing results have been good and that it's going to go forward and it's going to be a success. The Vive's an interesting one as well because Valve Steam. If you look at the figures of whose PC is compatible with actually running these games for the Vive, it's a very, very small percentage. But for them, I think it's a very, very slow burn product, and they're getting right into the technology now, so that when the people start developing for the product, it'll already be there and everybody will be ready. And once people upgrade their PCs, they'll be ready for it.
You called it 3, though, but really we have to say 4 because there is the elephant in the room. We still don't know how mobile VR, the Gear VR, and now Daydream is going to impact the market. Sorry.
I was also going to point out that there is a lot of money being sunk into this at the moment, and anybody who's paying attention to this stuff, Cryworks has just announced literally 2 days ago now, so that's a pretty significant, size of studio. That's not really an indie, and that's a lot of money that's going into them as well. So I think that
sadly the indies could fall by the wayside though in the short term. We are looking at a hemorrhaging of cash, and they were hoping that there was going to be a bigger. Well, most of the indies thought that the machine was most of the PC VR was going to be launched by now. They didn't think that they would still be waiting for even the pre-orders to be fulfilled.
I've been on those projects, and it puts studios in a difficult position.
Yeah, I think you'll see that there are more studios willing to put their money on the table, or at least be known that they're putting their money on the table.
Yes.
There was. I think this is changing now, as we've said with E3, but certainly like a year or so ago, I think there was an element of the big publishers wanting to keep the status quo, because actually when you get a disruption, it's kind of like when mobile happened and whatever, it puts risk on their status quo of owning the space. But now I think there's enough coming through that I think we actually need to put some money down.
Okay.
Well, the other publishers are frightened enough of Steam as it is.
Yeah.
So.
I'm aware there was a question over this side of the room, so if you want to fire that question at us.
My name is Sam and I'm launching a VR educational platform. My question is about augmented reality. We spoke a lot about storytelling in VR and world building, distant mountains and all this. Does this apply to the augmented reality and mixed reality in the same way, where we are still in the real world but we can have it enhanced with 3D and additional experience, or
I'm gonna sit here and nod and say yes, but I'm gonna also ask Jeff to answer this one as well.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna give Jeff a chance. Oh, is he not with us anymore?
Oh, Jeff.
We lost him.
Oh God.
He's gone to buy some Magic Leap shares.
Somebody else answer. Somebody else answer while I get him back. Hold on.
All right.
Me and Rob works on this augmented reality project with J.K. Rowling called Wonderbook, which was exactly that. It was augmented reality with a big canon that we had to be very true to, and it was all about books coming to life in your living room. And so I think very much you can do it. I'll hand over to Rob.
This is also very relevant because the other half of my day job now is I make augmented reality site-specific theatre. And I don't want to. I could do a whole talk about this. In fact, I have a GDC talk up. Come and ask me afterwards because the link is up. You don't need a password to get it. Usually you do, but this one is freely available, which I would recommend in this context. Basically, actually, augmented reality teaches you a lot about writing for VR and vice versa. Because what's interesting is that VR is trying to create the impression of a real world, and one of the ways it does that is by giving the player the illusion of complete freedom. In AR, the player actually has complete freedom because that's how reality works, and you can't put a glass barrier between them and their goal, which provides a narrative design challenge for AR, which is really serious, but also really, really exciting to develop for, I think.
I think it's also about who are you yourself?
Right.
So when you do, I think for us, when we did Wonderbook, if you were playing Wonderbook, you were yourself, but you had got this magic book from the Hogwarts library, so you were learning spells. But I was Dave, Rob was Rob. But
I literally put on my wizard hat and robe.
Literally put on this wizard hat. But in VR, you can be somebody else a bit more. I'm not saying it's cut and dried, but when we did London Heist, you were a gangster in this, that, and you were kind of role playing somebody else. You can sort of do both.
We have Jeff back, so I'm going to fire the question at Jeff again. So we were basically... Huh?
He's moved.
I decided to move him around on the screen. Sorry, Jeff, we're talking about your position on the screen. But we were talking about whether or not this idea of world building and this idea of creating that story Bible, etc., is relevant to both AR as well as VR.
I'm all about the mythology, and augmented reality. In a way, it's even more important because what you're doing is overlaying a world of iconography, symbology, semiotics over an existing world. So you really have to know that language and understand what's being alluded to so that there is consistency, so that everything is easily interpretable, or that the puzzles make sense and are somewhat solvable. So I'm all for creating a backstory and a key to the elements that can overlay in terms of augmented reality.
Okay. So, briefly, any other questions in the room before we move on from world building, which you didn't really discuss, to be fair?
Just a random question. Panel, what do you think is the next step in VR that will make it more usable, sellable, uptakeable?
Cheaper?
Yeah, cheaper would help.
Portability.
Wireless?
Portability, yeah.
I actually have a lot of time for portable VR, properly portable VR, because it has a completely different use case. If you can carry it in a rucksack, get on a plane where you already want to put a mask on anyway, you want to ignore your immediate surroundings anyway, you don't have the issue of not being able to see your dog or your beer or whatever. And instead, you just want...
What planes are you going on, Rob?
Oh, well, see...
Excuse me, sir, did you pack this VR yourself?
But imagine, like, the whole point being that you can watch a movie in IMAX. You can carry an IMAX with you, and instead of having to look at the tiny seatback screen. That's a use case that everybody can get behind, and people who can afford the hardware will probably end up doing that.
I'm curious, Rob, from your perspective, because I know that you do a little bit of immersive theatre work as well. And when they're performing for VR, it's a completely different set of tools and skills that they need. And perhaps the closest to this at the moment would be immersive theatre performance, in as much as, once you're on that road, you really can't stop, you've got to keep going. But it's also fully 360, it's in the round. So from a theatre actor's perspective, they understand that way better than somebody who perhaps, for example, acts for film and is used to stopping every 5 minutes to do another take. What your sentiment is on this from a director's perspective and from an actor's perspective in terms of this slightly different off-centre skill set that's going to be needed.
Yeah, I think you're right that immersive theatre is a skill set that is suddenly going to become super relevant for working in VR. But you could equally say as much about something like mocap, where that drew on theatre. I mean, I think about theatre a lot in VR in terms of staging, in terms of performance. When I'm directing actors, you always manage to kind of fit in a break somewhere, whether that's VO or kind of planning for something that's much more immersive. Basically, I think the thing will be that we'll have to find a skill set of an actor who is able to work in a continuous, in the round way, and so they can be consistent and they can be kind of 360. The protagonist can move around them and they can continue giving a consistent performance. And yet it will have to be modular rather than continuous, because actors will have to be able to deliver modules of performance, which says, if you stand still in front of me while I deliver my monologue, this is how I deliver it. But if at any point you, the player, decide to skirt around me and go around and, check out what I look like from behind, then I need to be able to fit in a performance which takes that into account, because otherwise I will look very obviously like a virtual person rather than a real person. And so you'll have to be able to take snapshots of people reacting to things that players might do, but find a way to fit those into also delivering something consistently like a monologue. It's a real challenge.
Dave, you have any thoughts on this?
Well, really, I mean, it was Andy Serkis who captured the phrase performance capture, and I think that's just going to blossom in this.
Yes.
The work that they've done, I think, is going to become more and more valuable. You can see now that really feeding in, and so people, from a performance perspective, understanding what the whole body's doing.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting what Rob was saying, because one of the challenges as well is they're going to have to do different takes or different lines that can be interjected depending on what the player does.
Yes.
But that's going to then be more stilted. It's going to be harder for people to riff off other people.
Yeah, game narrator engines try to cope with this stuff now, and it's occasionally
stilted. Yeah, no, we've suffered ourselves, haven't we, Rob?
Yeah.
We're creeping into emergent narrative design here.
Yeah. But I think one thing that we might see that would be really interesting is theatre that's both live and remote, so that you can connect and you get a performance from someone who is performing to you, because they're in a mocap studio somewhere. They're being captured and rendered live, and they are able to react to the things that you do. And so you sign up for a slot, and you go in and you have a one-on-one theatre experience, which you can do in the real world, so why not do it virtually, where you can get more people in?
And I think one of the things is, with the technology, well, one of the things that I always felt was a fault with the games industry is it took the Hollywood model rather than understanding where the Hollywood model came from. It didn't go back to the roots of where storytelling and narrative really come down. And I'm talking about cave paintings on walls here. I'm talking about the real basics of where it is. We're talking about theatre in the round. We're talking about in the round. That's Greek, that's ancient Greek sort of civilization. We need to go back to basics, and we need to look at how stories were told at that basic time and then expand those out into those virtual reality experiences, because the last thing you want to do is do a virtual reality experience where you have to walk through a crowd, because that's I'm just from what you two have been saying. So it's this is too much data.
But everything then needs to work in terms of what dialogue is being said at the right time and still work. And that's going to be, to me, that's a
And that's the interesting piece,
really
is that
daunting.
nobody's really addressed that from a software perspective. You know, if you're a script writer or a screenwriter, you're using very particular software to write your script, and that's great. You've got a lovely linear script. But when you're writing, as you say, in the 4 quadrants, which is something that, if you go back to the research, Kathleen kind of brought this up as this idea of the 4 quadrants. The problem with that is when you're trying to read that from a linear perspective, it becomes incredibly difficult to then realize, actually, I'm looking at something in the 360 round, but I'm also looking at something in the 360 vertical. And people forget that when they're writing for 360 environments, that you're actually writing for the full sphere, not just the round the room around you, but also over the top as well.
But there are examples out there of other industries that do this. I had this same kind of conversation at Immerse, which is the Planetarium and Full Dome Association conference, the planetarium industry. And they, turned to me and started throwing things onto the stage saying, yeah, we develop for the round, we develop for 360. So there are, I think, like all agencies, with the cinema industry's early days, they borrowed from the stage and then they started to borrow from other narrative sources. The same way that the video game industry, we in the VR are going to have to cherry pick the best applications from different industries. And I would really do point to looking at how the Full Dome industry approaches this problem when they're doing the narrative for their sector.
I just want to wave the flag for interactive fiction here, because there are already formats and pieces of art that kind of on the game side, but also not its own beast, that take into account. In games, there are already plenty of games that you really can't write in a straight line. You can't write in a screenplay format. I write a lot of my scripts in Excel, but I prototype in Twine, and I use other interactive fiction formats. I edited a game called 80 Days, which is kind of incredibly multifarious, and it's, there are tools to take account of those, but they're not kind of coherently built into the industry, the games industry. Yeah. Ink, which is what the game 80 Days was made in, it allows you to think and write in multiple simultaneous parallel possibilities, which is absolutely crucial.
Yes.
So, for the canon in this type of environment, you'll need a self-developed database which deals with that, and specifically for exactly what that project's going to do, whether it's a narrative tale or things like this. And it's also, if we start to move into this sort of multimedia thing of like engaging comics.
Entertainment as a whole, look outside of them. As Kevin was kind of pointing out, planetariums and, other industries, whether that be, research, data, analytics, Defense Department, whatever it is, people, go out there, check out DARPA, for crying out loud. But honestly, really go and have a look outside of our own industries, because there are people who will be doing something that ultimately there's something you're going to be able to rip from that, and it's going to be useful to you in some way, shape or form. But Jeff, I'm aware you haven't answered this question yet. So software, hardware that you would recommend?
The one I've been satisfied with has not been invented yet. So I mean, I'm using standard screenwriting software like Final Draft for this, but I'd really love for a software that can synchronistically at the same time, that can allow me to shift instead of up and down on my screen, almost literally sideways, so that we can design experiences that allow for an audience to literally branch off, experience something, and yet give us a sense of the timing, so that if the audience dovetails back into the main narrative, we essentially know roughly where that audience member is going to re-enter the main linear flow of narrative.
Yeah.
That would be very helpful.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Just to say, one other thing that you can do is that there are interactive narratives that have been made in YouTube using nothing more than YouTube tools, wherein you can use the annotation system to give the user a click. They click on an object and they click on the frame that's superimposed over the object in the video. That can then just take them to a new link, which can start a new video. You can start the video at any time. They can watch that section of video and then return to a video at a defined time in the original video, or go somewhere else. There's a branching music video that was made. There's a knife crime video that was made a few years ago now. Yeah. And that can help with the timing as well. So that's a possibility.
Okay. I'm going to assume that Sam is happy with that question now. What I wanted to also cover was this idea of this cross-industry learning being essential. And when we say cross-industry learning, we're not just talking about the film and the game industries, which is where everybody seems to think everybody needs to talk to. The idea of using visual cues and visual annotation in a slightly different way because it's comics. And within the frame of comics, you have a very limited amount of real estate. So you look for alternative ways to be able to visually provide indicators and clues that perhaps people who work in film or, other mediums may not be thinking in the same ways.
Yeah, I mean, the comic industry, whenever we create things, we are limited with the space that we've got. We've got generally an American-sized page. I personally work in a way that makes sure that there is no break. Talking to Phil, we were talking about sort of like being ripped out of the immersive experience when we're writing. And for me, I am always trying to write in such a way that there is no visible break. And it allows you just to gently flow through something. Because I read sometimes some Marvel comics or DC comics, and they're really confusing. You really need to concentrate in order of what's going on, because the way that they break down pages, and the way that framing tends to work, you've got to be really, really careful, and you've got to be respectful to the person that's reading.
To the point of cross-industry learning,
yes.
Our industry is a magpie. We do like going to other industries, and I spend a lot of time with the military simulation sector as well as the hospitality industry to literally steal the ideas and applications that they're using. And it's surprising how much in the military simulation sector for training is applicable to enjoyment. Entertainment and training are very similar things, and that's why we have examples like game technology and game science learning taking place at the moment. We're not just dumber, but we also like to enjoy ourselves while we're becoming dumber. And the issue that I've noticed a lot, to give you an example, I keep on talking about our friends at The Void with their Ghostbusters experience. The technology that they're actually using was developed for cockpit tracking within a fighter jet. So we're seeing the swords being beaten into plowshares. We are actually seeing technology from the military sector being applied into the entertainment, but we're also seeing our technology ending up in the hands of the military and the simulation sector. So I think people, the writers with enough clout, know that the storm is coming their way, and this is going to be quite a shake-up, and they're trying to protect themselves. They're trying to create little bunkers where they can at least share information and not get washed away by the tide of change. We were seeing groups, little communes being formed of writer communes where they were preparing to gather and share information about how to work for new mediums such as immersive AR and VR applications. That said, I get this awful feeling that a lot of the established trends and nuances and genres that we are trying to scrabble to create to fit the virtual reality vernacular, there could be a kid in Singapore in his bedroom right now that is going to come up with one of the major tropes that is going to shape this industry, and there's nothing that the AAAs or the large production houses can do to stop the circulation of that concept.
Yep.
Indeed. It'd be interesting to see how many bad habits we take with us into VR.
Bad habits is the thing. Like, in terms of looking for just a rule of thumb for hiring a writer for VR, there is a reason that we talk about games a lot, because it encourages a certain type of the ability to leave a story partially finished and then hand it to the player to finish. So I see a lot of live action 360 scripts that come in, and they're kind of for a script treatment or whatever. And you can always tell if it's been written by somebody who thinks film first, because at some point it will go, this happens, and then we see. And that's the point where I have to go, no, stop, because we don't. You don't know what the player can see. You don't know if they're paying attention to what you want them to pay attention to. They might be focusing at a spot on the wall. You don't know, and if your story can't cope with that, then it's not a virtual reality native story.
One of the problems in the games industry at the moment is that as the games industry is sort of moving out of the trailer park and like rummaging through the bins, it's actually found that there are significantly valuable writers there who then suddenly get snaffled by somebody else, and then they put longer and longer sort of contract terms in to say, oh, you can't leave. But in the end, if a bigger company wants you, they'll pay the money to like buy you out, and so this is the thing. It's got to start equalising on like payment and on the technology side, on every side, because these people, if virtual reality takes off and it's big, these people, the people who can do it, the people who can work it, will be the ones everybody wants.
Let's give you, sorry to interrupt, let's give you a real world example of how violent this is going to be. Magic Leap. How many people here know about Magic Leap and their technology? Oh, great, fantastic. Augmented reality technology, no one's seen it. There is some people that think it's the second coming of Jesus Christ. There's other people that think that it's smoke and mirrors. Anyway, 3 of their top executives left the company to go away and start another company. They are being sued now because they're told that their contract stated that they cannot work in this medium or any other medium similar to this.
So, Jeff, in terms of the application of AI in managing all of that kind of emergent narrative storytelling and the multiple facets of what we've got going on with narrative, do we think that AI is the natural next progressive step of how we manage that?
I think that the more sophisticated end of the video game industry has already offered us algorithms and methods to make the choice that one makes in narrative more organic and more of an immersive experience. Where AI comes in really will be in making the interactions with the characters richer and more complex, where there will be an intuitive response to the participant, the audience member. To me, a way to really make, earlier you were talking about, someone was talking about moving through a crowd and how that can become a chaotic experience because everyone's talking and so forth. So I think we're a little ways off, and I think that that console video game technology can help us with making these experiences richer and more immersive. But I'm very much looking forward to how AI can change the game.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
I was just, before I came here, I was talking to somebody else about this who's
you
working
can name
in
him.
the
Go
games
ahead,
industry.
Imre.
Imre from Bossa Studios. And he was talking about a new system that actually looks at canon. It slowly learns the canon, and it can already start saying, "Oh, you've got this character here and this character here. They've never had an adventure together, but I can suggest one." Yeah. In his own words, he said he felt it was about 2.5 years away, and that's not no more writers. The writers still need to be there because you're not going to get AI writers very, very soon. But you're going to, and the other problem with AI writers, I'm just going to drift into philosophy very briefly. Wittgenstein says if a lion could speak, we wouldn't be able to understand it. What Wittgenstein's saying is because a lion's it's a predator and a carnivore, it has completely different concepts.
So on that note, gentlemen, I want to thank you all for participating. You have been listening to Kevin Williams, Andy Ewington, Phil Harris, Rob Morgan,
and me,
Dave Ranyard, and Jeff Gomez. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you have any questions, feel free to catch these guys on their way out. In the back of the room, because we've run out of time and I feel really bad about this, there is a lovely person with a HoloLens who would like to demo his HoloLens, so feel free to go and corner him. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us on this Digital Jam session. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. If you like this content, don't forget to subscribe and review. digitaljamsessions.com